Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Farmers for Climate Action's very special event, Creating Change in Regional Communities, which is a discussion between three extraordinary women who are fearless champions for rural and regional Australia: Fiona Simson, Cathy McGowan, and Gabrielle Chan. We're thrilled to have you all. Thank you. Before I hand over to Gabby to open up this evening's conversation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I live on, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respect to their elders past, present and future. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that you are all joining us from right now. It's an extraordinary time currently, with developments internationally and closer to home recently. I feel we have serious cause for optimism. The impetus for change has perhaps never been greater. And I know that what you will hear tonight will inspire you, and through the vast experience and wisdom of our three guests, we'll see more clearly than ever a path for change for rural and regional Australia. And also we'll better appreciate how vital regional communities are to the nation's recovery, progress and future. Over to you, Gabby. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and thanks for asking us to come. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of where I am, and that's the Wiradjuri people, and acknowledge their leaders past, present and future in this NAIDOC week. Now, the two women with me obviously need no introduction. For those who don't know me, I'm a journalist and author of Rusted Off, but the two ladies with me have got a long and glorious history in rural and regional affairs. Fiona Simson runs a mixed farm with her husband Ed on the Liverpool Plains. She's been a local councillor. She was the first woman president of the New South Wales Farmers Association and the National Farmers Federation, where she sits now. She's also on a range of boards. And I'd just like to point out that she landed the first NFF policy statement on climate change. I think that's right, the precedents. Cathy McGowan is also a farmer, a founding member of Australian Women in Ag, responsible for, with Voices for Endive, for the only upset really of the 2013 election, and went on to serve 2 terms in Parliament. She's worked on policies in Parliament from the crossbench on things like regional development, drought, code of conduct, strangely timely for right now, code of conduct for MPs. She's just written a book with Monash called Cathy Goes to Canberra, Doing Politics Differently. And it's my pleasure to host this conversation tonight. So welcome to you both. I'd like to start, given this is about change in regional Australia, I think we've got to sort of set out the parameters of what the challenges are. In other words, why do we need change? And I'd like to start maybe with Cathy talking about or nominating the 3 biggest challenges for rural Australia right now. Why do we need change? I think she's on mute.
You're on mute, Cathy.
Yeah.
God, don't you love that? Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity tonight. The 3 areas that I'd like to nominate around the challenges that we face and the need for change. If I could start at the grassroots in my life, it's about service delivery, and particularly about service delivery that's governed by the Commonwealth. Let me say childcare, education and aged care. They all fall under the Canberra model of one size fits all and don't respond to the vagaries of our communities. The second area where I'd like to nominate changes needed is in the planning of investment, particularly around infrastructure that comes out of Canberra. That's mostly managed by grants, mostly from the National Party, and it's done on often a marginal seat arrangement, and we get caught up in the sports rorts sort of example. So the delivery of infrastructure around the country is not based on need or a national approach. So that leads me to my third area, which is the need I see for a plan or a strategy around how the regions fit into the national economy. And I'd particularly like to highlight the work that I know Defence has done. The defence industries and the Army, Navy and Air Force came up with a combined strategy, which they put to the Commonwealth. They got the Commonwealth agreement for 2% of GDP every year to be invested in this strategic approach for growing defence industries. And for the life of me, I cannot see why in agriculture and related industries, we don't have a national strategy and a national allocation of a percentage of the GDP to go into growing this most important industry, if you want. So I'd say service delivery, infrastructure related to the national plan and a strategy for this country.
Fiona, do you want to nominate 3?
I will, Gabby, and thanks very much, and thanks for having me here too. And I will just pay my respects to the traditional owners of the Liverpool Plains, the Gomeroi people. Our farming community has had a long history of working together with the Gomeroi, and it's based on mutual respect. And I think that's very, particularly with some of the battles we've had here, that's a really important relationship to note. So I've chunked it up a little bit, and a little bit the same as Cathy, but a little bit different. And it's something that, as an avid regional person, somebody who is always talking up regional Australia, we try and avoid talking about some of the real challenges and issues because we don't want to put people off. But in actual fact, it's really important that we do. Cities have problems as well. Urban areas have issues too. And I think we need to, even though they're challenges, and I'll frame them up right now as massive challenges, there are also opportunities in amongst that if we look at some of the solutions. None of it's easy, but it is. So the first plank I started with was people. We've had a culture and a policy trajectory of urbanisation in Australia for quite some time now. In the early days, the explorers came and the settlers came, and there was this huge focus on getting everybody out to the regions and building infrastructure and settling land and growing food and fibre and all those things. But then in more recent times, we've reversed that trend, and we've seen the populations move to the urban areas. And in actual fact, we're one of the most urbanised countries in the world, and that has impacted greatly on some of the things that Cathy was talking about. So from the delivery of health, education, childcare, infrastructure, spending on infrastructure, the tyranny of distance, obviously a huge issue for many of our rural and regional people. But because we draw our lines on our electoral boundaries, according to population centres, and I've had lots of really interesting conversations about that with avid democracy people, then that's, it does change the way that our governments look at spending, and it changes the way that they allocate spending. And people in New South Wales and the government in New South Wales sees a tram up George Street as more important than actually building some nation building infrastructure or roads or rail through our regions. So people, keeping the best and brightest, bringing people back, jobs, all of those things is in that one. The second one's about how do we get economies moving, and that is, and I think Cathy spoke about this, how can we actually get a policy in place of regionalisation? And it has to be in place across the 3 tiers of government. It has to be strategic, it has to involve industry. It's something that many governments have tried in a piecemeal way to look at, but inevitably it's been about campaign spending. It hasn't been strategic, it's been politically motivated often, and we just haven't seen those strategic benefits flow. There's some great examples of some programs, quite recent programs in various legislatures that are actually quite good, but one-off sugar hit type of projects, and we have to change that. If we're actually trying to grow regional communities and regional economies, NFF, has led the charge on growing Australia. We think agriculture and regional communities, as we're coming out of COVID, have a real opportunity to really lead the growth of Australia. But that's going to require value adding at home, value adding in our regional communities, and changing the way we do a lot of these things. So we need a regional growth agenda. And the third one is around climate. And we have to know in regional Australia, and particularly with my agriculture farmer hat on, just how we are actually going to function in a more decarbonised environment. And at the moment, we in NFF, again, leading the charge in terms of how we look at managing the environment, how we can actually look at how farmers particularly manage the environment, given that we manage over 50% of Australia's land mass. And how can we actually do that better? We know we currently have a huge suite of 3 tiers of government, duplicative, overlapping, often land management controls, but we know that our traditional owners have actually managed the landscape very successfully for generations. So, let's change the way we look at land management. What sort of things do we need to be doing out on farms if we're going to survive in this new climate, literally the new climate? And obviously the expectations of the global communities. We've seen a number of banks now coming out with CN 2050 goals and business communities. So we need to exist in and work out what our place is and how we're going to survive and thrive. Sorry, Gabby, a bit of a long, detailed answer there.
That's okay. I mean, they're big issues, aren't they? And in a sense, both of your answers have fused how you start by pulling a thread on regional Australia in any area, and it ends up in so many different places. For me, I would nominate climate change, but that includes, things like soil, water management, all those landscape management issues that you talk about, and how we can sort of bridge the divide in I guess in some metropolitan areas. There's this sense that, well, you've got to manage that yourself. But if you're acknowledging that there are either positive or negative benefits over the boundary fence, then you've got to think about a better way of doing that. The strategic point that Cathy made, I think, is really important as well. And it kind of surprises me that as an economy and a nation under white settlement, at least, that was built on the so-called sheep's back, we don't think about those things more. We don't think about how regional economies work. I just want to talk for a while about with you about how you came to leadership, because I think that's really important when we think about why is it that some people might not be stepping up. And Cathy, you've related, I think, in the process of talking about your book, the moment when a group of young people picked up the phone to you and said, what are we going to do about this? Nobody ever steps up in the country. And you talked about, the not challenging the status quo. There's very much a culture of, we don't want to rock the boat. Why do you think that is? And what is it that sparked your ability, well, your decision really to step up? Mute.
That is such a good question about it. And I think I was always a leader by design. Family background, expectation, go to school, do things at school. And I got involved in agriculture and became president eventually of Australian Women in Agriculture. So I was happy to be a leader in that field. I came to politics by accident. And what I really want to talk tonight about is, I think there are zillions of leaders in our communities in lots of different places. What we are really short of is political leaders. And I want to acknowledge you, Fiona, in the fantastic role you play as a political leader in agriculture. But when I got to Parliament, I was absolutely gobsmacked by the lack of debate in Parliament around agriculture. And after I'd been there for a while, it was me, basically, me and Rebecca Sharkey, we became the major people who introduced private members' bills, who debated and talked about agriculture. And the reason for that is because the main parties, and there's been a few comments in the discussion, is that the Libs and the Nats fight over ag. And they fight over who gets the portfolios. And when they get the portfolios, they don't talk to each other. So just a quick example, when we were discussing childcare, the national changes to the childcare scheme, I went to the Nats and said, what are you going to do about childcare for the regions, Aboriginal people, for all of us in the regions? And they said, Cathy, the childcare portfolio is held by the Liberals. We don't have an opinion about that. And I was gobsmacked. So I ended up moving a whole lot of amendments to that and couldn't get any of the Nats to come on board. And I've since discovered that there are more regional rural seats held by the Liberal Party than there are by the Nats. And they don't play, they don't cooperate. In fact, they're fiercely competitive. So when your question is about becoming a political leader, as opposed to a community leader, it's a really hard gig, because you have to decide, are you going to play with the parties and then play by their rules, which are quite limiting, or are you going to stand as an independent like we did in Indi? And what I was really surprised about, and I talk about in my book, is how once our community got organised, how we wanted to have an independent member of parliament, because it delivered so much more than what a political party did. So I think what we need, a bit like what you were saying, Fiona, about reframing the new landscape with climate, we really need to reframe the political landscape by designing independence in there as a competitive force, particularly for the regions. And consequently, we'd have better competition in the seats, we'd have better representation in the seats, and then I hope we'd have much better outcomes in Parliament.
Fiona, do you want to talk about how you came to it and how you see leadership, particularly in the ag space?
Yeah, I think I was a little bit different to Cathy. So I actually didn't set out to lead so much. I was at school, I sort of held a variety of different positions and things. But when I married Ed and moved to the farm and got involved in the community and things, I was happy to take on some roles and do some things. But I never sort of envisaged that my career and my role would go where it has now. And the thing that has, and I've talked about this, I'm sure other people would have heard, but what happened in my community was that the Liverpool Plains is a very strong agricultural community, and it's also blessed with some amazing natural resources, very deep soils, underground water aquifers. It's just the ideal place for growing food and fibre, to be honest. And it has done so for generations and generations. And there was, when mining developments were planned at Karoona, the community were absolutely incensed that this amazing agricultural region had actually just not really been consulted in the process, and that the process was so poor that even the bits at which where the process was meant to check in with the community, it really was a nonsense. Things like a mining warden's court, for example, which I'm really glad that we were successful in getting rid of, which were just a completely diabolical, one-sided mess. And the community felt really disempowered. And so, is that the right word, disempowered? Sounds like disemboweled, but anyway, it's disempowered, if that's the right word. And anyway, as we were going through the process, then I started to get really angry and passionate about it. And the community was very passionate too. But we thought, look, we are just a little community group. It was actually a really great thing to galvanise the community around. We had lots and lots of community people who are still very passionate about it, because we still have one coal mine sitting here, Shenhua, that we're still trying to get rid of. But everybody sort of got to a point where we thought, okay, we really need to have some more influence. Where can we have influence? We can have influence in local government. What are the established bodies? We're all here talking to ourselves. We're a bit of an echo chamber. We all believe in, what we're saying. We all agree with each other, but clearly we're not, getting through to people. So how can we have more influence? And so that was when, and I didn't have a good enough excuse as to why I couldn't sit on local government. Didn't have a good enough excuse as to why, we identified New South Wales farmers that needed stronger policy in this area. And so I put my hand up for some of those jobs and ended up, now really focusing on with a strong focus and passion now for policy and the making of good policy and how that happens. And really loving my roles both here on the farm and in the different organisations that I sit in. We badly need more people to step up and get involved in some of these levels of policy making and leadership in regional areas. And it doesn't have to always be in jobs like mine, but I do think that people at the moment are stepping away from traditional groups and traditional alliances. And Gabby, you talk about it a lot in Rusted Off, and you give a really great account and some of the reasons why. And I think that's happening, but it's not necessarily leading us yet. Maybe it's just timing. Have we yet got to that better place? Because if we just sit in this, talk to each other and we all agree with each other, then it's actually not actually making the change, that the widespread change that we need to happen. So it's a bit convoluted, but I think in agriculture at the moment, more leaders. I encourage everybody I talk to get involved in advocacy for their organisations and for their industry. And for their community, because we need people at all different levels.
Isn't the hard part, though, with leadership, that balance between bringing people along and consulting, and also seeing what's necessary, and in a sense guiding and explaining people so that they will follow you? I mean, I think some of the things that I've heard about from people who run for politics is number one, the loneliness, and the need, which is what Voices for Indi did, to build an ecosystem around the person who's up front. That often you see politics, people will say, oh, well, you should run, or you should run, and they push people out the front, and then there's no one coming up behind them. And I wonder if both of you can talk to that, Cathy, with how important that ecosystem was, and Fiona, whether you feel, properly supported by agriculture, because I know leadership roles in agricultural advocacy can get really willing. People have very firm views, and I think that's partly to do with people, culturally dealing with being the master or the mistress of their own kingdom, and they come outside and they just want to butt heads like two rams. So maybe, Cathy, if you want to talk to that first.
So I do, and particularly about agriculture, because my leadership growth was mostly through being president and involved in Australian Women in Agriculture. And that was really tough in the early days, because the patriarchy, the blokes, all thought we were out to break up marriages and split up farms. So from this is the 1980s and 90s and whatever, we as a group of women had to manage this incredible fear that we were working in, and we learnt to do it. So in that learning to bring people with us, to explain to the blokes that we were married to them and we loved them and we wanted the same outcome as them, we weren't the enemy, and bringing them on, we learned an enormous amount. And when I got to politics in Parliament, so many of those skills about building coalition, about creating an ecosystem of support, of not dividing and conquering, actually working together, I learned through my political period. But I also want to acknowledge one of the very early women who was just a fantastic role model for me. Her name was Heather Mitchell. And Heather Mitchell was the first president of a farmers' organisation in Australia, particularly the VFF. And she was president in the very early days when I was involved in agri-politics. And that was great. When she came to leave her job, we Women in Ag put on a function for her to say thank you and acknowledge her contribution to us women. And one of the women at the group, Sarah Parker, this is for you, one of the women said, Heather, and Heather was just a grand, beautifully dressed Western District farming woman. And they said, Heather, well, what's the most important lesson you've learned that you want to hand on to us younger women? And Heather said that what she hadn't done, and that she wished she had done, was put her hand out and bring more women with her. She said that when she left, after her period of being president, there were no women coming through the pipeline. And she said her singular failure was to do that. And so what I learned from that, and Australian Women in Ag has learned, and we women have learned, is that in our work as leaders, the harvesters of tall poppies come past and they'll cut you off regardless of who you are. But the reality is that if there's a mob of you, one of you can go and 2 or 3 will step up. And what's happened with women in agriculture now, it's just so not an issue that there's women everywhere in agriculture. And that's because of that ecosystem we created as an organisation of bringing women with you, bringing young women with you, running training programs for young women. And I have to particularly acknowledge the work of Pat Hamilton in South Australia, and Donna Digby did a fantastic job in making sure that there was a pipeline. So that's one of the things that I learned. And it's not by accident that Voices for Indi has an ecosystem, because many of the people who were part of that organisation were women who'd been involved in Australian Women in Ag. They were men and women who'd done the Australian Rural Leadership Program, so they'd learnt leadership skills. They'd done the Alpine Valleys Community Leadership Program. So they brought with them this collegiality of having a process of leadership and a process of creating an ecosystem where there's room for everybody. So that's what I would like to see on the national agenda, is as we build this strategy for the nation about agriculture, a bit like what the Army has done, it's not just about service and it's not just about infrastructure, it's about and it's exactly what the Army, the Defence is doing. Defencing is creating an ecosystem of leadership. It's creating an ecosystem of education and training in all the different aspects that we need. So they've integrated people into their planning. And it's something that we used to do, I think, in the old days with agriculture extension, but we've lost it. And I picked it up through Australian Women in Ag. But I'm really keen for this idea of you've got to build your capacity of people to be leaders. You've got to build a pipeline for leadership, not just community, because I think we do community well. And Fiona, I want to see less accidental leaders. I want to see more leaders by design who can do a little bit like what we did in Indi, saying, okay, you've got the job for 6 years, Cathy. Here's the job, you're going to do it. And after 6 years, you go off and do something else, go and write a book, and somebody else will come through and they'll do it differently. They'll do it for 6 or maybe 8 years and then they're off. So we actually have the process of sharing it, but building, enabling when I go and I get chopped off for whatever I do, other people will come through.
Yeah, so in a sense that leadership ecosystem also, we should underline, is probably nothing fancy. It's just people who want to achieve a goal getting together so that one person or two people aren't doing all the work the way they often will do in, you know, the various town groups that are in any country town. Fiona, do you want to talk to that idea of support? How supported you feel, whether there's success? I know you've put that Women in Ag leadership succession, yeah, but also thinking about it in terms of the first point I think you made in the first answer, and that is often there is a defensiveness in ag, I think, and I think that sometimes bleeds into rural representation, that they don't, you know, there's this feeling that we don't want to hear the weaknesses because we're so desperate to be positive. And how can we change things and solve things if we don't want to hear it?
Yeah, I think the support thing and an ecosystem of support and maybe it's the culture of support is really critical. And NFF has, we're in our 3rd year now, the Diversity in Ag Leadership Program, which has actually it started out as a tiny wee little program, and it's actually been quite successful now in terms of cultural change in a lot of the organisations that employ women and some of the women in our industry and our community. So that's just a very small little idea that we thought we absolutely needed to make sure. And I was the only woman on the board at New South Wales Farmers when I got there, the only woman on the board at NFF, and we've now got great women representation on both of those boards. But I think, so for me, it's not just, so it is about, of course, diversity in all its wonderful frames. So, you know, gender and ethnicity and for farmers, it's about, you know, making sure you can spread the net wide in terms of the different things we grow and everything. But creating, I think, the culture where you can have these respectful debates and discussions about really, amazing, very critical policy issues. But you can also, these are policy issues that have to go through and hopefully become policy in government. And so to do that, we have to make sure that we have, really great factual reasoned debate where we have a culture where we're encouraging people, not just women, but young people as well, to get involved and interested in some of these outcomes that we're talking about. Because it's very easy to just have a very single, narrow focus and think, I'm just for, for health, or I'm just for this, or I'm just for that. And it's much easier to prosecute that sort of an agenda. But agriculture is really broad. Health and infrastructure and childcare, all those things are really important to us. They're sort of fringe, but they're important. And if you think about the issues that agriculture is involved in, it's biosecurity, it's trade, it's all the millions of different things. It's connectivity, it's energy, it's all those things. So the way that we've done it and the way that I've tried to do it in NFF, and I've been lucky, I've had some very supportive, you don't choose the people that you're board with, obviously, in these organisations, everybody's elected. And so you have to work with who is there. And I've been able to, really benefit, I think, from some really supportive and collegiate boards. We haven't always agreed through the years, but we've always been able to feel supported, and I've always been able to feel supported and hopefully engender a culture which is tricky, which is about enabling others. Because at the end of the day, you as a leader have a finite life. As Cathy said, it's important to look behind you and see who's coming along. And sometimes if you've got a really massive change agenda, then that's really difficult to do, because you might not, get any of those outcomes. And at the same time, you're building capacity in your organisation. But the way we've done it at NFF is to try and make sure that, particularly when we've got some of these really tricky, complicated issues, to try and get people, the members all make the policy at NFF. I don't have anything to do with it. I just come in and advocate for it at the end of the day. But make sure that people start on the same page in terms of some of the information, because with some of these tricky topics, there's so much information flying around now on social media and everywhere else that unless you do start on the same page, then it's very hard to actually lead. And you don't want to be. Gabby, you started off this section by saying, is it leading? Is it enabling others? What is it? Well, if you get too far in front, you look behind you and everybody's just gone. And I've certainly had situations of that. So it's really important that we bring this people when we're creating good policy that's going to engender massive change, which is what we need, and we have the opportunities that we've got right now, that we actually have this groundswell of people. And even though there might be somebody a couple of steps in front, you really need to badly look behind you and make sure that there's a good swell of people there as well, and that there's new people coming in all the time who actually can subscribe and keep pushing you forward, I think.
Has it been harder for you as a woman at the helm of an organisation that was very male-dominated?
I've been really well supported, but I think sometimes, there has been this sort of, and you can still see it in politics now, where, it's very combative, and people have talked to me about, and it's just I don't have that sort of an attitude to how we have policy debates or discussions. I just don't, I don't think about being on a rugby field, because that's just not me. So I think there has been a little, particularly in the early days, there was a little bit of that. And I think, I've actually probably more felt, I think, sometimes from outside the agricultural community. But again, you just can't listen to social media too much. You can't get distracted by that, because all sorts of things get said and done on that. But no, I'd say generally I've actually been, because there's been not so many women role models, I've actually been very supported by men and the men that I've worked with. And I've certainly just done, what I felt that I could do and passionate about. But overwhelmingly, it's been a culture of support with the team and with the electeds, rather than anything too combative.
Okay,
Cathy, on a
Cathy,
farm, Gabby. So a bit like being on a farm.
Cathy, you talk about succession planning with independents, and I'm presuming you're talking about succession planning, for example, in seats. Because you've been very focused on the political space, the public political space. How do you had that group on the crossbench that was very collegiate in a way, even though you were all independents. And in fact, you were in the same corridor physically in the building, which made that caucusing a little bit easier. But what's the difficulty with being an independent, but then, as you say, building that collegiality on the crossbench in that space? Because you've managed to get legislation started, that sort of thing. How does that happen? I mean, there used to be a group, I remember, I think it was in Peter Andren's day, and it was called ICANN, and it was designed to be that, you know, support for people who wanted to stand for Parliament, no matter who they were.
So there's a couple of things to say about that. Again, I'm not like Fiona in the fact that I'm not part of a family farm. I bought my own farm and I run my own farm. So I'm my own boss. And I've had to learn to get in the services that I need to help me do what I need to do. And just dip my lead to my boyfriend, David Wolfenden. He is a great help, but, you know, getting services there means you've got to build cooperation. That's the first thing I want to say. And the second thing is my competitive advantage in my life is that I am a woman. So I don't see myself competing with men. I see myself as, I do what I do because I'm who I am. So when I went to Parliament, that was my advantage. There's no other farming women in Parliament like me. Oh, that's not quite true. There was Nola Marino she's a dairy farmer from Western Australia, and she was a Liberal and she became a whip. But I was quite unique in my space. So I actually worked that to my advantage. And I'm saying this about being a deliberate leader in this sense, because I knew to get things done, I could never get them done if I competed with the men. They would, on the rugby field, they would win time and time again. So I didn't even try to do that. I thought, now how do I actually build this space? And one of the lessons I'd learned, again, from another really good woman, the president of the CWA in New South Wales, Margaret Smith. We'd been on the National Rural Women's Advisory Council together. And Margaret used to get really cross with me because I wasn't subtle enough. And Margaret would say, well, if you want to get things done, you do it this way. And I said, oh, you know, like we have a dinner. She said, well, we have a dinner party. We're really good in CWA at having parties. So we were on the National Rural Women's Advisory Council and we wanted to put Margaret's theory into place. So we organised a dinner party with John Anderson, who was the minister. And that was all fine. But Margaret's made me sit down and work out the seating arrangements. Who would sit next to who? And then she made everybody go through their dinner conversation before we actually sat down. And I came away thinking, oh my God, how clever is that ability to have a dinner party and sort everything out at the Brassy the night before you had the formal meeting the next day. So we ended up, after a period of time, inviting secretaries of departments, staffers, assistant ministers, who'd all come to our dinner the night before. We'd do all this really good work. And the next day when we had our formal meeting, it went so smoothly. So I went to Parliament having enormous advice and skill about how to be an effective lobbyist, playing to my strengths, which were to create community. So I knew I was good at doing that. So the answer to your question is, once I got to Parliament, it was, well, how do we create community here? Where are the likely partners? And I just want to tell this story because I want to talk about climate change. And as you said, Gabby, one of the people who's down the corridor for me was Clive Palmer. And I can remember just being flummoxed, really. How do I work with Clive Palmer, Queenslander versus Victorian, and a whole lot of difference? But what we found in common very early in the piece, that Clive actually has a really soft spot for climate and climate adaptation. Now, I can hear everyone scream and go, oh, you cannot be right. But if you read my book, you'll see the little story in there about how in the very early days in 2018, the Abbott government wanted to get rid of all the infrastructure around trading, emissions trading, ARENA, Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Now, that's fine. So Clive was prepared to vote to get rid of the trading of emissions trading, but he was quite on side about keeping ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And there was one other one, I can't remember what the third one was. And at that stage, he had 3 senators in the Senate. So we worked together with the wonderful Ben Orquist from the Australia Institute. We developed up a package. Clive came on side, his senators came on side. And in the end, the vote in the Senate, the emissions trading scheme went, but all the other architecture was saved because of Clive. And I'd like to think I had a really important role in working with him, not on the whole agenda, but a little bit of the agenda that we had in common and that he was prepared to act on. And we formed a most unlikely friendship. Now, it hasn't stayed the full distance, I say, and I'm not going to advocate for everything that Clive does, but I just wanted to say that there's such skill in that approach of being a community builder. And it's a bit like working in the fire brigade on the truck. You know, you're all in this together. What are the jobs we're going to do and how do we make this work? And I learned that through the Country Women's Association, from the VFF, the NFF, of how to actually work with people on what we've got in common. And it's what you were saying before, Fiona, not looking for the divide, actually looking for the goal that we share and how we're going to work on that together.
Yeah. Sorry, Gabby. I was
want
just
to add something to that?
I was just going to say that I actually have heard Cathy speak before. I've heard her speak many times and I'm always in awe. But one of the things that has stuck in my mind is, I think it's saying that she said, be bold, be brave and build a bridge. And that's actually, in those 3 little actions, you know, that is the tenet of leadership, because building bridges, building alliances, concentrating on what you agree on and trying to find a way through. That's actually what we do in NFF when we've got really complicated policy positions. We try and my chairs, my task force chairs, who are amazing independent people, their job is to actually try and get consensus. Now, if you think of the whole of Australia at the table, think water. You've got the north of Australia, the south of Australia, you've got the Murray-Darling Basin, you've got all these different things happening and different priorities for people. How on earth can you actually create meaningful policy that through getting consensus? And that's actually by people concentrating on, you know, it's being bold, being brave, building a bridge. It's trying to bring people into and share values. And when we're talking to urban communities at the moment, because NFF we have a big focus on this urbanisation thing and all these generations of people now in urban areas who don't really know where their food comes from, don't understand what it's like to be in regional areas or live in regional areas, then we've got to talk about value matching and try and make sure that we can talk in a way where their values match ours. And if you start doing that and you start focusing on the outcomes, so the trouble with, I think, some of the political situation, and Cathy's been right in the heat of it in Parliament House, is it gets so combative so quickly. And, you know, it's us versus them. It's you know, you fight, and what's portrayed on the television, I'm sure, is only just a little tiny microcosm of some of that stuff. But off to the fringes, we know that there's lots of people talking about building bridges, alliances, and it's really important that if you're passionate about issues and you're passionate about change, then you have to be proactive and really try and build those alliances. And then that's the way to create change.
The cultural stuff is hard, though, isn't it? And it's been a feature of politics, and that metro country divide really, well, for forever in politics, but particularly in the last 10 years. And I think it's really interesting. And Cathy might have a view on this as well, is that the difference between people who are cranky with that, the incapacity of the political process to solve problems. So the ones who are voting, giving the up yours vote, you know, to anyone that isn't a major party, and then the difference between, you know, an outfit like Voices for Indi, where people were more involved. And I think that those cultural things. But the questions are starting to come in now, and I'd like to ask Fiona first, given the NFF policy that you've just landed, a climate change statement, someone asked, how can we work with politics and get action on climate change? What can we do in the community to make it a reality? And I think it was interesting probably a month after your statement landed, we're still getting statements from the Agriculture Minister, David Littleproud, about the banks moving the way they're moving. You know, markets are moving, financial sector is moving on climate change, the Business Council. So many organisations, private and public, are recognising this, and still it's a bit like marriage equality. We're kind of dragging representatives along to try and just inch forward. How do we get change on this, do you think?
Well, I think we just keep doing more of what we're doing. And, you know, even though, and there's politics at play, Gabby. I mean, I think part of the, you know, just reflecting back on what we were talking about a moment ago, I mean, part of the reason that people get angry and frustrated is because they feel that they're not being represented. But then there are people who are core believers in some of these institutions and groups, and people who need to be represented too. So I just don't think we should let politics get in the way of the good outcomes. What I think we should be doing is, you know, politics is one thing, and the statements that those, you know, people, but when you're looking on the ground about even, you know, what the government is doing in terms of progressing towards a decarbonised economy and hopefully a CN goal. You know, at the moment they've already got a CN goal in the second half of the century. Yes, the other, you know, business institutions, banks, the NFF, farming community, a lot of people have moved and actually put a goal on that at 2050. But the government has actually already been, you know, progressed. If you look at where they were, you know, a couple of years ago to where they are now, I think there's always more to do. Don't get me wrong, but certainly they have made some steps, and I think we just have to continue to keep working on it. But I think people have to also continue to get involved and engaged in groups that are broad church groups, where they can actually try and make sure that those policies are flowing through to some of our politicians and some of the people in control and influence, because we've already seen, you know, even in this week, there's been, you know, a bit of a discussion in Parliament about, you know, climate change and where the different political parties sit and where the different representatives sit, and each member is basically playing to their electorate. So at the end of the day, we want the government actually to support change. That's what we want. We want the government to actually put in place these policies. And so you need to, if you just concentrate on people who are not part of the government, then you're never going to actually enact the change that you really need. So, you know, we just continue to, I listen to what the minister says, and yes, we get on well, we work together well, and I'll continue to talk to him about why it's, you know, what our policy is, what it is, and I'd hope that others will continue to talk to him about why their policy is what it is, and we continue to just have those conversations, concentrate on the facts. We try not to get personal, we try not to get angry, because that's just not how it works.
Just in terms of participation, Cathy, do you have many people contacting you wanting to do the same thing and run for Parliament?
Look, not me, but I know Dennis Ginnivan's on the line tonight. So if it comes to me, I do a hand pass to Voice for Indi, because they're the organisation that does that. My job was representation. And I know that there was, particularly when we first got elected, Voices for Indi ran this most magnificent training day in Oxley, where I think they called it Indi Shares. And I would love to do another one of those where we open it up to the community to come and look about what we do. So that's one thing. The second thing is there's now some really good leadership programs where I can encourage people to go to. So the ARLP, obviously, but there's very specific women's programs, the one you run, Fiona, there's Pathways to Politics, and there's some really good programs happening now. So I'm really happy to encourage people to do that, and for me to take more of a proactive step I'm really keen to get some more independence into Parliament, because what I noticed made a huge difference was that when you've got the vote, you've just got so much responsibility and influence. And I just want more regional people to have access to what Tony Windsor had, Rob Oakeshott has, that I had, that Rebecca Sharkey has, that Bob Catt has got, which is on the crossbench and being able to speak your mind, be true to your own values, and then push the system, and working in concert with, if I could say, with the NFF. So one of the projects that we did together, which was fantastic, Fiona, was that drought legislation, the $100 million, that the NFF had done all the work, all the thinking. They were able to say to me, here's what you need to do. And I could go in there and move all the amendments. And together we got this magnificent change in policy. And if we had more independence from different parts of the regions in Parliament, I'm sure we could do a lot more of that collaborative work with the leadership that we've got within our agricultural groups and the political power in Parliament. So I'm really on a mission now to support the work of Dennis, support the work of Voices for Indi, support your work, Gabby, support the work that you're doing, Fiona, and everybody else, but really particularly to be going out there and finding the good candidates and saying, get your act together. There doesn't actually have to be a recipe for this. You guys know how to work your communities, but just get there and do it, because it makes a difference if you're in Parliament. What
about you, Fiona? You're in that seat, New England, aren't you? Who's there? Joyce. Do you think you'll run next election?
Haven't you
ever fantasized about it?
Haven't you ever seen any of my interviews? What about the one about sticking knitting needles in my eyes and all those things? No, look, I am on record as saying no, I'm not running. And I always say never, because I never know what life's going to throw at me. But at the moment, I'm really enjoying my role. I'm hoping that there's still quite a long way to go. I think there's lots to do. And I think there is people needed at all sorts of different levels. And yes, we do need people, putting their hands up for Parliament. There's no doubt about that. I have to say, I know Cathy talks about it, but I think it's a fairly punishing environment to be in many ways, and not for the faint-hearted, but I'm sure it's very rewarding as well. And not for this little black duck, no, but I think we definitely need to have, and I guess this is where, if we're really going to create some of the issues that we've talked about in terms of the inequity in decision making, the inequity in spending, addressing some of the priorities, for example, like at the moment we're talking about the Infrastructure Australia list that actually prioritises a bus shelter in the middle of Sydney to some nation building infrastructure out in parks, because of the way that those priorities are set. Now, if we're going to actually create some of those actual changes, then we actually have to start really focusing on regionalisation. It's something that has eluded governments historically for many years. We need to actually we need to be stepping up and promoting leaders. That's definitely part of it. And yes, we need to be encouraging good people to step up for Parliament. Yes, we need to be having this agenda, but we also need to be really looking at the nuts and bolts of what drives rural and regional commodities, what drives agriculture, how we manage the land. Gabby, you and I have a piece in a book that's just come out now that Tanya's edited about what's going to happen after COVID. And I really do believe that we at agriculture can be driving the growth, but it's not growth like by growing double what we grow. It's nothing like that. It's about creating value in your community, value on your farm. And part of that is through some really excellent environmental management and sustainability management. So I think, there's a lot to this conversation, and other than saying, let's throw the whole democracy up in the air and restructure our electorates or get rid of the state government or do whatever, some of those things are much harder. But if we actually start to encourage the actual proper discussion and strategic discussion of regionalisation, then I think in terms of some of the inequities in decision-making and things, that will help resolve actually some of those issues.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll take that answer as maybe in the future.
That's never say never. I've bought a camper van. That doesn't sound like I'm going to Parliament.
But the issue you raise about going in, and the old idea, I'd rather have knitting needles or have my teeth pulled or whatever, is a real issue, isn't it? Particularly this week when we see the sort of behaviour that was highlighted on Four Corners. Improving that is harder if that environment is seen to be not conducive, particularly for women, because women have been so successful, particularly on the crossbench. They, Cathy, Karen Phelps, Zali Steggall, Rebecca Sharkey, they're quite particular characters. Do you want to comment on that difficulty about going into that lion's den, if you like?
Look, all I could say is that when people say that to me, Gabby, I look at them and say, gosh, motherhood's really difficult. And I would never choose to be a mother. In fact, I chose directly the opposite. I looked at that job and thought, I'd much rather be a farmer. So, and you grow into motherhood, you grow into parenting, you become better at it by the time your child's 21. And I think it's the same with politics. You look at it and go, I just don't want to do that job, but you grow into it, you're mentored into it, you find your partners, you find your community, you build an ecosystem, just like you build a family, and then you make it your place. And what I think with politics is there hasn't been enough of us do that. It's a bit like if I could use the family analogy, you're the daughter-in-law and you marry into a particular type of family that's really tough to get on with, and your friends look at you and say, look, how do you cope? And you go, well, yeah, I happen to love the bloke and I love my life and I put up with it. So that's how it was for me. It's like I loved the job. I love rural and regional Australia. It wasn't all perfect, but it was a really good job. It was really worthwhile. And the knowledge that I could pass it, that Helen Haynes wanted to do it as well. In fact, there were 3 people in Indi who put their hand up for the job. So I don't think there's a shortage of people who actually think that this could work for me. But people like me have actually got to talk it up. People like Fiona have got to be talking up our leadership roles. And we've got to put our hand out and say, not only will we help you when we get there, but we'll help you in getting there. So those independents that you talk about, Rebecca Sharkey, Voices for Indi, I went across and spoke to Nick Xenothon's team and helped her get elected. When Karen Phelps put up her hand, Rebecca Sharkey and I went up to Sydney and we helped campaign and we shared the knowledge. I know with Zali, the Voices for Indi people helped her a lot. So building up that collegiality and support so that you're not by yourself, and that when things get tough, a bit like your sisterhood, you can say, oh yeah, that's going to happen. And when that happens, do this, this and this, and here's where you go to, and give me a phone call and I'll work it out. The first time's really difficult, but after that, you get a system. But it's really tough to do it by yourself. So that's why I really love the idea of the leadership ecosystem that you can build that protects you and creates a pipeline for other people to come through.
I think there's some great women coming through. If I look at the National Party now, there's actually some great women coming through there who are really experienced and passionate about their community. People like Susan up in the north, people like, oh gosh, the names escape me. It's too late at the night. But there's 3 or 4 new people now who are really passionate and good, keen people. So maybe it's looking at, Cathy, did you, in Parliament, I'm going to ask a question here, Gabby, this is your job, but in Parliament, did you find that sometimes those boundaries just crossed over and that you forgot about just being an independent, and you actually thought that you could work with the sisterhood, or you could work, you didn't?
No. And particularly with the National Party, they always knew that I was their enemy in that sense. And so, for example, like moving private members' bills, in the very first instance, I went across to Michelle Laundrie and said, would she second my private members' bill? And she was a new member of Parliament as well. And she went to the blokes and they said, oh no, we never second. That's the formal rules, they don't do it. And then again, when we're trying to get the inquiry into regional development, we had a coalition of people working on their report, which came down at Regions at the Ready, but there was no way the government was actually going to support the recommendations. So even though we'd done the sort of collectively, we'd written the report, when it came to rubber to hit the road, those members of Parliament didn't stand up for their own report, just got lost.
Yeah.
So it didn't happen.
It's a really interesting discussion, I reckon, because the and you know, I've known some fantastic independents like the one you're talking about, Cathy, the ones you're talking about, and yourself, and Helen Haynes now as well. Fantastic. But I've also had some really interesting conversations with people like Bill Heffernan over the times, who's a really passionate regional Liberal. And I said to him, why are you a Liberal, Bill? Why aren't you a Nat? Why aren't you an independent? Why aren't you? And he said, because we're marginalised so much in everything that we do. the last thing that politics needs, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but I think it's a really interesting viewpoint. The last thing that politics needs is, and the last thing I need is to be marginalised even more. I want to join a party which is, you know, big and where we can create change and where I can have a chance of being a minister and where I can do this and where I can do that. And sometimes I think that, and agriculture does it really well. You know, we are very good at starting new groups. So, you know, we shun some of the bigger representative groups because we don't think they represent us anymore. And then we start up our own group where we all have people who really believe, you know, but sometimes it can be a bit of an echo chamber where you're all just agreeing with each other, and you're not actually generating that change that you need to actually make. So I don't know what's right or wrong, and I think I can sort of see both ways. But I think when I'm thinking about how we create change, for agriculture particularly, you know, we want people to come into the groups, some of the established groups, because they're well resourced, they're there for the long term. They need really great people to be influencing policy and getting involved in policy development. But we find people are running the other way. So I think that's, you know, that's one of the challenges. And I think sometimes with politics, we might do the same thing.
But I mean, I take your point, but isn't climate change the perfect example of where that hasn't happened? So, you know, you can get so involved. The NFF, you know, as a farmer group, has mostly associated with the National Party because of history. And yet still you're ahead on climate change and having to drag this party along, and they're still resisting arrest.
Well, no, I think our members now, and you've written about our members, Gabby, our members are out in the regions, you know, so our members represent farmers who live all over Australia in many of the regions. And I think you can't say, you know, historically people have always thought that farmer representative groups and the National Party went hand in hand, and maybe they did. And now certainly we have, you know, and we do, you know, it's my job to actually form relationships with the ministers, whether they're National Party or whoever they are, and really not to have a political view, because my job is to get outcomes for agriculture. And so I work with those ministers, and I also work with the Liberal ministers for trade and environment, and you know that our sphere is wide and our representation is wide. But all I'm saying is that there's something wrong somewhere if there's such a big groundswell and all the business groups and everybody has come out and you know, doing these things, yet if they're feeling still that the government is not making and taking the actions that they want, then why is that? I'm asking you a question back, I guess. Why is that? And is what we're thinking the right way to go about it by forming, you know, smaller groups and focusing on those things and talking? Is that the right way to go about it? I think it's really interesting. I mean, I'm about a broad church. I'm somebody who would rather get involved, roll up your sleeves, even if you, and I'm saying to people, look, even if you're feeling that these groups are not representing you at the moment, maybe they should be, and maybe that's why they need you in there. And that's why I got involved, because I didn't actually think that the groups that I was members of were representing my interests in the way that I wanted them to. So I say to people, get involved. Don't say, oh, I'm not going near them. I say get involved. And maybe that is part of the whole political conundrum that we're in now, where people are getting disenchanted in the regions and they can create change, and maybe it's just time where we will, you know, that will all go through. But at the moment, I think it's a really interesting conversation, and I'm not sure that there's an easy answer.
I have a view actually that a change for something like climate change has to come from the outside now. I think it's going to be like marriage equality. I think, you know, the only way to change things is from the outside and take the pressure in. But I just want to combine a couple of questions that we've got here. We've had so many questions, and really it takes us back, given we're going to wrap up at 8:45, it takes us back to where we started in a sense, and people are wanting to know what is a unifying vision for regional and rural Australia. And a particular question that I think relates to it that probably needs embedding in that unified vision, if I may be so bold, and that is a question around land usage and the things that are very close to you, Fiona, and that is the usage battles between farmers and miners. We've seen Joel Fitzgibbon go to the back bench today. He's in an electorate which is quite near you. How do we create a unified vision that could really get backing also from metropolitan Australia and find a way forward? So maybe you first, Fiona, and then Cathy, because you were involved in that big committee around regional development. That would be great.
I think it's like any of these wicked problems, it's not one single thing. There's no silver bullet, disappointing as it is, because it would be way easier. But some of it comes from policy leadership. In terms of, and it has to be, I think, really a lot of it has to come, some of this policy leadership has to come from the federal government. So, you know, whether we're talking about energy, whether we're talking about infrastructure, any of those things, we have to have some policy leadership from the federal government that then the state government, the local government, the community buys into. And of course, there's that's where it gets a little bit complicated. You know, how do you actually have that happen? And how does it work so that everybody's together? But I think by overlaying, and there has been some policy initiatives in the past, and Cathy's right across all of these, where people have actually literally overlain perhaps some draft federal policy with some state policy. And suddenly you've got some amazing programs where you're focusing on, so what's the, you asked, what should we be seeking? And I think we want to be seeking strong, sustainable communities. That's what we want. Now, strong means we want jobs. We want to be keeping our best and brightest. We want to be attracting people into our regions. Sustainable means everything in the environmental sense as well as the health and holistic sense. So we want good health. We want good education. We want healthy waterways and sustainable waterways. We want healthy soils. We want to make sure that we can manage our landscape in a sustainable way and that farmers can still turn a buck if they're doing that. But we also, the community part of it is very important. And it's how you actually can, and combativeness is not going to do it. And the political cycle is not going to do it, because all you're going to see is short-term funding programs for different electorates at different times when they're under pressure. What you have to have, and we must continue to push for, is a strategic policy that is focusing on this strong, sustainable communities. We want we need more people to get that mass. We do want to look at our we haven't talked about it tonight, but our reliance on overseas countries for some of the things that we absolutely need every day came to the fore in COVID. It's critical that right now we can actually have a look at doing some of those things. Technology will help us. We need to be connected. We should have connectivity as a given. We need the strategy for all of these things we need. And it's a matter of how you, and I think NFF has outlined some of those in our Growing Australia document. We've outlined others in our roadmap. And we're fortunate that the government is on board and ticking off a lot of those priorities, but it's pulling it all together into this strategic vision that's actually going to lead. And maybe the National Cabinet, Gabby, the way that it operated at the very beginning of COVID particularly, is a shining example of something. And I was lucky enough to sit in the Admin Council for a long time as well at the beginning there. And everybody worked really collaboratively and well together, put politics aside, put their actual individual political hats aside, and worked collaboratively and well together. So maybe that's something, and that's certainly something that when I despair sometimes, I think that's something that is taking me through, and maybe that's something that we could use, that model.
Cathy, you sat on that committee and it was a great report, the Regional Development Report. Looked like a strategic vision in a sense for Australia, and there were crickets when it came out pretty much.
The things that worked, and I absolutely so agree with what you're saying, Fiona, but at that time we had leadership from the top. God bless Malcolm Turnbull, for all his faults, he backed it. And he was supported because his darling wife, Lucy Turnbull, knew about place-based planning. So we put it to him that one of the ways we could do what Fiona's talking about is have place-based planning. And then he was a great supporter of what was then called the regional city deals. And we got his agreement to do regional deals, which in Albury-Wodonga, we ended up getting $3 million to bring local, state and federal government together across the border to do some planning around a regional deal. Launceston similar. So we've got a process that we know works, that Malcolm backed. Sadly, the current Prime Minister is not providing that leadership. The second thing is that you've got to have a process that works. And the policy process is called a green paper and a white paper and then a policy position. So we need leadership from somebody in Parliament currently to have an agreement for a policy development process about the strategy for regional Australia. So a green paper, the ideas are put together, that's put out for consultation. Then that's developed into a white paper, which looks at the broad policy framework, and then that's consulted, and then that comes into policy framework. And that process is an agreed way that Australian governments work for policy. We need to do that for agriculture. And the third thing we need is a really clever process of engagement that builds that ecosystem that we've all been talking about tonight, the ecosystem that says there's a place for you in this, and there's a place for everybody in this. And we'll provide the support mechanism so you can grow your capacity, you can grow your leadership, you can grow your involvement in these topics that are of interest to you, not just leadership programs. I don't actually mean that. I mean actually growing capacity in the community to be the change that we need to see. Now, I'm waiting till the next iteration of leadership happens in Canberra so that we can have another go at getting the top-down support that we need that will actually engage us regional communities in doing what we do so well, which is place-based service delivery, infrastructure planning, and then the politics that we need to do at the local government and in our farmer organisations to do it. So look, it's not rocket science. It's not really hard. It does take political will. And sadly, the current mob don't have it.
It has to be bottom up. That's the one thing I would say, even though the strategic policy thing has to come from the feds at some point. It actually, Cathy's right, place-based learning, place-based driving, communities like the Indi swell. It has to be community focused. And so many of our processes just keep the community, really the community consultation is tokenistic to say the best. It has to, we should start with local government actually. And so I don't want anyone to misinterpret what I said about the federal government leading, because it's not quite right. The federal government actually has to their regionalisation strategy needs to funnel down. But in actual fact, the plans for the regions need to funnel up. Local people, local government needs to start with them and then be supported by the state and federal government policies. So in a real way, that's bottom up, not top down.
So the concrete example is a group getting together at a local level and refining the points that they feel are important for their place, essentially writing the dot points of a strategy that could be taken forward.
Yeah, but it's got to be in the context of government policy. So we still need, like that defence model, you need the commitment from government to actually fund the stuff and do the enabling, because we've just got so many examples when community have done all that work and nothing happens. So you've got to have the commitment from the Commonwealth to play. And currently we don't have that.
No, there was a really good program in New South Wales called the Strategic Activation Precinct Strategy, I think it was called. And it's actually finished, unfortunately, but the parameters of that study, which were about engaging and involving local people, strategically planning what they wanted in their community, diversifying their community, all the planks of what you needed to do were there. But you need that sort of a program nationally.
And no, you need it long term. Like, that's part of the problem. Those policies go for a little while. They don't give them enough time.
Then you're left high and dry.
And then 10 years later, someone's going, how could we do this? Reinventing the wheel constantly. Anyway, I could talk to you till midnight, but I better not. So thanks very much for your participation. It's just been a fantastic conversation, and I'll hand over to Cam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cathy and Fiona. These insights were incredible, and I think just looking at the chat on the side and just knowing how I feel, I think we're all really inspired to get our hands dirty and do whatever we can in our communities. And Cathy, I know you have a book as well just out. Did you want to talk just for 30 seconds about that?
Look, it's called Cathy Goes to Canberra. So it's a bit of my personal story, but there's 2 chapters in the end that talk about what I've learned. And basically it's a bit of like, well, if you want to be an independent and run, which I hope some of you do after tonight, there's some really good information there. If you go to my webpage, cathymcgowan.com.au, you can find the details, but also ask at your local bookstore and newsagents and they'll get it in. It's published by Monash University Press.
Fantastic. And yeah, once again, thank you, Cathy. Thank you, Fiona. And a huge thank you, Gabby, for moderating this. This was brilliant. And don't think you're going to get off lightly here, because a few questions came in through the chat mentioning that you live in Riverina. And after your cheeky question to Fiona, wondering if maybe you're thinking that you might run.
Excellent.
No, I'm not thinking that I might run. I've got another book to write. Definitely not.
Not as fun, but look forward to reading that one as well. Gabby also has a book, everyone, Rusted Off. It was an incredible read about politics in regional Australia. So thank you once again for joining us. Thank you everyone for the comments in the chat. And that was incredible. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyed the chat. Another time, girls.
Yes, look forward to it.